Most of us would never connect the word terrifying with elves, my younger self included. Well, what if I told you that elves are one of, if not the worst, horrific dead inside fantasy race in common fantasy media? But, to be fair, most of the time when they show up, the story tells you to relax a bit. The world feels older, calmer, more stable. Elves are wise, beautiful, long-lived, and close to nature. They are mentors, guardians, the race with wisdom and grace. That's the version most of us grew up with. But if you stop treating elves like a comforting aesthetic choice, and instead think about what a species like that would biologically and psychologically look like, things start to feel off pretty quickly. Not because elves are secretly evil, and not because dark fantasy is automatically better, but because their way of existing doesn't line up with how humans experience the world. I'm also not talking about every elf in every fantasy setting. Some worlds do very different things with them. What I'm talking about is the most common version. The Tolkien-shaped Lord of the Rings kind of elves that show up across a lot of fantasy. Long-lived, emotionally controlled, deeply traditional, slow to act, and very sure they've seen all of this before. Once you really look at that version, elves stop feeling comforting and start feeling unsettling. And the reasons for that have nothing to do with common power or magic. The biggest difference, to no surprise, starts with time. Elves don't just live longer than humans and most other fantasy races. They live long enough that time stops feeling sharp. For a human, a single war can define an entire life. A single political collapse can shape generations. A bad decade can feel like the end of the world. For an elf, that same war might be one of hundreds. Borders have changed before. Ideologies have risen and fallen before. Even disasters start to feel familiar once you live long enough to watch similar patterns play out again and again. You see this reflected in Tolkien's Elves, when they talk about kingdoms rising and falling with a kind of distant sadness rather than shock. You see it in The Witcher, where elves remember a world that existed long before human empires and treat those empires as temporary occupants. That difference alone creates a distance from worldly affairs. Not because elves hate humans, but because they experience the world on a scale humans can't really share. And later, when we go to biology, you will see why that's important. Now take that long view of time and apply it to relationships. Imagine making close friends who you know from the start you will outlive. Not once, but over and over and over again. Imagine watching people you care about age, slow down, and die while you stayed more or less the same. Imagine doing that for centuries. Of course, that kind of semi-immortality problem is kind of known. But the actual effects on a whole species aren't really shown in fantasy. At first, you would grieve the same way anyone does, but if you reacted with full emotional intensity every single time, it would break you long before your body ever gave out. So you adapt. You would see the adaptation in the form of restrained. As an elf, you would still care, but you would be careful about how deeply you let yourself fall into every other race relationship. You would learn to keep a little emotional distance, not because people don't matter, but because losing them hurts the same way every time. This is where a lot of elves and fiction seem to land emotionally. They're kind, they're polite. They're rarely outright cruel, but their reactions feel muted. Their grief is quieter, their joy is more controlled. They don't attach with the same urgency humans do. Characters like Elrond are a good example of this. He clearly cares about Middle-earth and the people in it, but he responds to a crisis with patience and reflection rather than panic. And in a lot of modern fantasy, elves offer guidance and perspective, but hesitate to fully commit themselves emotionally. From their point of view, this is healthy. It's how you survive centuries of loss. From a human point of view, it can feel deeply uncomfortable. You bring something that feels overwhelming and immediate, and the response you get feels calm, measured, and just a little bit delayed. You feel it most clearly when urgency enters the picture. Urgency is a human survival trait. Deadlines matter to us because we age, we weaken, and eventually we run out of chances. Waiting can mean never getting another opportunity. Elves don't live under that same kind of pressure. There's always the sense that time is still available. That doesn't mean elves ignore threats. It means they evaluate them differently. You see this dynamic play out constantly in fantasy. Elves always hesitate. They hold councils, they delay action, whilst humans are already fighting and dying. In shows like The Rings of Power, this hesitation is often framed as arrogance or stubbornness. But another interpretation makes just as much sense. Elves act like beings who believe that if something truly threatens the world, it would still matter tomorrow, or next year, or after one more debate. To humans facing immediate loss, their patience doesn't feel wise, it feels like abandonment. Culture pushes this divide even further. Human cultures change quickly because they have to. Generations turn over fast. Mistakes get forgotten. New ideas feel worth trying because the people who suffer the consequences might not be the same people who proposed them. Elven cultures don't work like that. When you live for centuries, you remember failed reforms. You remember artistic movements that promised renewal and ended in instability. You remember philosophies that sounded perfect on paper and fell apart in practice. That's why so many elven societies in fantasy feel formal, ritual-heavy, and slow to adapt. In The Dragon Prince, elven cultures are deeply symbolic and bound to long-standing customs. They don't rush to change, not because they are incapable of innovation, because they are, but because they've already seen where reckless change can lead. The downside is that a culture that rarely needs to change can lose the ability to do so when it actually matters. This brings us to morality, which is where elves stop being immediately uncomfortable and start becoming generally frightening. Elven moral decisions are shaped by long outcomes rather than immediate suffering. Actions are judged by where things end up, not how painful the process is along the way. If a war looks like it will burn itself out eventually, stepping in early can feel necessary. If a kingdom seems temporary, its collapse feels less tragic. If you know a forest will recover over centuries, short-term destruction feels tolerable. For humans living inside this moment, that perspective feels cruel. For elves, it can feel responsible. Neither side is obviously wrong, but their moral instincts don't line up. Humans prioritize stopping pain now. Elves prioritize minimizing damage across time spans humans will never experience. This is why elves in so many stories choose neutrality or limited involvement. They observe, they advise, they protect what they see as essential, and they let the rest play out. Fantasy often treats that as arrogance or moral failure. But it can also be read as long-term thinking, taken so far that immediate suffering stops being the deciding factor. At that point, interacting with them doesn't feel like talking to someone who might be persuaded by emotional urgency. It feels like dealing with a living archive, a walking precedent, someone who remembers how similar arguments ended centuries ago. They don't escalate emotionally. They don't argue from fear. They respond with memory and context. That's intimidating in a way brute strength never is. Fantasy often softens elves because it wants them to be aspirational, wise, safe, comforting. But doing that removes the most interesting consequences of their existence. What living to learn actually does to values, empathy, and responsibility. Elves should feel like beings who understand the world deeply, but don't fully understand why a sense of urgency feels so overwhelming. Imagine you're living in a world where almost everyone dies in what seems like a few weeks at best. The only thing that's not fast-paced is you and your people. And that matters because it changes how conflict works. Elves like this don't create tension by being villains. They create tension by being reasonable in ways humans can't afford to be. They make human desperation visible. They turn immortality into friction instead of wish fulfillment. They add discomfort without spectacle. At this point, it's tempting to wrap things up and say the problem with elves is just time. The time doesn't stop at feelings, culture, or morality. Because time isn't just how elves feel about the world, it shapes how they function inside it. And this is where things stop being abstract and start becoming genuinely frightening in a physical, biological way that fantasy almost never talks about. Reproduction. Elves are usually depicted as long-lived, slow to age, and hard to kill. At the same time, they're often shown as fertile enough to sustain stable populations over thousands of years. On paper, that sounds elegant. Biologically, that's a nightmare. In real population biology, long lifespan and low reproduction go together for a reason. Species like elephants or whales reproduce slowly because individuals occupy ecological and social space for a very long time. If they reproduce quickly on top of that, that would genuinely push out everything else. So if elves live for centuries and still reproduce at anything close to human rates, they become a demographic threat without ever lifting a weapon. They basically just need to exist to conquer anything they want. Every elf born is a long-term occupant of land, resources, political influence, and memory. They don't cycle out of society the way humans do. They accumulate everything. Over time, that creates an imbalance. Human populations turn over rapidly. Leadership changes. Institutions decay and rebuild. Elves don't rotate out of power in the same way. An elf who holds land, authority, or knowledge can hold it for centuries. That means even peaceful coexistence slowly tilts in their favor. You can see hints of this in fantasy, where elves are portrayed as ancient minorities who nonetheless control disproportionate territory, magical sites, or cultural capital. In Tolkien's world, elven realms feel sparse, but they're also untouchable, protected by age, magic, and continuity. In The Witcher, the tension between humans and elves is framed as political, but underneath it is a biological reality. Humans expand fast, and elves endure. Now imagine what that looks like from a human perspective. Imagine sitting across a negotiation table from an elven council. You argue, you plead, you threat sanctions, retaliation, war. You explain that your people can't afford to wait. And they listen, calmly, politely. Because they don't have to win the argument, they just have to wait. They know that in 50 years, everyone currently shouting will be gone. In 100, the leadership will be different. In 200, the political situation will have reset itself. They don't need to outmaneuver you in a meeting. They can simply let biology do their work. For humans, negotiations are urgent, because losing time means losing lives. For elves, time is leverage. That's not a threat you can embargo. It's not something you can deter militarily. It's baked into how long they exist. And that makes every agreement asymmetrical from the start. You negotiate a treaty with elves, knowing that the same elven representatives might still be there when your great-grandchildren are born. You compete economically with people who don't retire, don't age out, and don't forget how the system works. You build cities next to a population that doesn't need to rush, because time always favors them in the long run. Even if elves never intended harm, the imbalance is real. And if their reproduction is extremely slow instead, that creates a different kind of horror. A species that lives for thousands of years but rarely reproduces becomes pathologically conservative. Every death is catastrophic. Every risk threatens extinction. That pushes a society towards extreme caution, isolation, and control. Suddenly, protecting elven lives justifies almost anything. Human wars become irrelevant background noise. Short-lived species become expendable variables. If elves are rare and ancient, then preserving the population might matter more in their eyes than preventing enormous short-term suffering elsewhere. Either way, the biology traps them. If elves reproduce too much, they dominate without even trying. If they reproduce too little, they become brittle. Hyperprotective civilizations willing to let others burn to preserve themselves. And it explains why elves in so many settings withdraw, isolate, or draw hard boundaries around their territories. It's not just pride, it's survival logic playing out over centuries. From the outside, that logic feels cold. From the inside, it feels unavoidable. That's what makes them terrifying in a grounded way. Not because they're cruel or superior, but because their biology pushes them into positions where coexistence is always unstable. You're either living next to a species that slowly replaces you, or one that quietly decides you're acceptable collateral damage. Neither outcome requires malice, and neither one is easy to argue against if you're the short-lived species. That's the part fantasy usually avoids. Elves don't need to be cruel to be dangerous. They don't need to conquer, dominate, or even actively oppose short-lived species like humanity. Their biology alone turns coexistence into something unstable. If you argue with elves, you're arguing with something who can outlive the consequences of saying no. If you negotiate with an elven government, you're negotiating with a group that can afford to wait out your entire civilization. That's why elves would feel terrifying. And if you were human and would live in a world like that, you would feel it. Every decision would feel temporary. Every agreement would feel provisional. Every moment of urgency would be yours alone. And that's the real elf problem. Let me know what you think about it. As you may have noticed, I had to take a small break due to some minor health problems. But now I'm as healthy as a dwarven beard, and will provide you guys with a video every Monday. Stay tuned, subscribe, and leave a like if you'd like to support me and don't want to miss out on my next glorious revelation.